Hello students, this is Professor Chalai, and in this video we're going to look at light as a wave. As always, you can follow along with our Chapter 6 workbook because we're beginning Chapter 6 this week. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe the properties of waves, describe light as a type of wave, and also relate the different light and wave properties such as the frequency of a wave to the frequency of light, the wavelength of light, and also the speed of light. Let's get started. And to get started, let's imagine we're looking on top down on the surface of like a lake or some water. And we have these ripples spreading out over the surface of the water where the brighter spots are like the bumps of the ripples and the darker spots are the troughs of the ripples. If we were to view this from a side angle, let's see what that would look like. This is the side view of a wave that's moving forward. So this is going to help us understand a lot of things, a lot of the different properties of waves. So let me just pause this. And so we have this nice ripple pattern going. So let's draw that nice ripple pattern. And this is going to help us talk about the various properties of waves. So the wavelength is simply the distance between when one point of that wave sort of repeats. So this point to that point, that's going to be one wavelength. We could choose a different point. Maybe we could have chosen the bottom of the wave to the bottom of the other wave. That's the same thing, right? That's a wavelength. So a wavelength is simply the distance of one full, we're going to just call that a full wave. And because it's a distance, the units are going to be the units for distance, usually measured in meters, or if we're talking about light wave that we can see, usually nanometers. So that's the wavelength of a wave. The peak of the wave, right? These peaks here are often called the crests, and these lowest points are often called the troughs. I think that's spelled correctly. So basically, the wavelength is when you go from one crest to another or from one trough to another. That's the wavelength of light. The speed of light is simply the speed at which one of those crests moves forward at. So the speed of light is measured in c, but the speed is just the time it takes for the trough to move some distance, or the distance that trough moves in some period of time. So the units for speed are going to, the speed of any wave is going to be the units of speed that we have for a car or anything like that, usually in meters per second. We'll talk about the speed of light in a bit, but the speed of the wave is sort of the speed at which the wave moves forward, whether it's the light wave or a wave on the ocean. The amplitude of the wave, so let me draw a middle line there. The amplitude of wave is sort of the height of the wave from the middle up to the top. That's the amplitude. So that will be another amplitude going down. So the amplitude is simply the height of the crest, right, which is the toppest point, or the depth of the trough, the lowest point. So from the middle to the top is the amplitude, or from the middle to the bottom, that's also the amplitude. Okay, and let's talk about frequency. So here I draw a snapshot. I froze the wave and then I draw the curviness of the wave. But usually this wave is moving, right? We saw that the wave is moving forward. And so the frequency is basically how many wavelengths pass a specific point each second. So let's say you had a point right here and this wave moved past it. How many wavelengths pass that point every second? That's the frequency. So the frequency is the number of waves or wavelengths passing a point each second, or per unit, each per unit of time. It doesn't have to be second, could be any other unit of time. Per unit of time. And so the units for frequency, right, is going to be waves per second or just per second. That's 1 divided by second. Or sometimes you would see people use Hertz, and that's because 1 per second is the same as 1 Hertz. That's Hertz. H-E-R-T-Z. Okay, so we have the wavelength in units of meters or nanometers. We have the units for speed, which is in meters per second. And we have the units for frequency, which is in per second. Now, these are general to all waves, but we want to talk about light waves specifically because in this unit, we're going to talk about light, and then we're going to move on to electrons and talk about how they can be described as waves as well. So let's talk about light waves specifically. Light waves are a special type of waves that are actually two waves combined. They're an electric wave and a magnetic wave. So we put those together and we just call them an electromagnetic wave. So light would be these two waves combined, and here's what that looks like. So the red in this diagram is the electric wave or electric field component of the wave, and then the blue line, so this is running up and down on the page, and then the blue line here represents the magnetic field component of the wave, and that's sort of running inside and outside of the page or the screen. So it's really hard to draw or visualize. But light is made up of these two types of waves simultaneously sort of reinforcing each other as it moves forward. And so this is why we call light an electromagnetic wave or electromagnetic radiation. So light can be described as a wave, or specifically a wave with two different components, an electric field and a magnetic field moving forward. And as the electric field and the magnetic field are interacting with each other, they move forward at a very specific speed. And that speed is the speed of light, c. And that speed of light in a vacuum is exactly this number right here. So this is a number that we should try to have memorized. We can simplify this to 3.00 times 10 to the 8 meters per second if we're just looking for it at 3 sig figs. And we can relate the speed of a light to the frequency and the wavelength because we know that speed is meters per second. So the speed of light can be written as the wavelength, which is in meters, times the frequency, which is in per second. So we get speed of light in meters per second. So this comes in very useful because we always know the speed of light, at least in a vacuum. So if we wanted to find, let's say, the wavelength, then the wavelength will be the speed of light divided by the frequency. So if we know the speed of light and the frequency, we can find the wavelength. On the other hand, if we wanted to find the frequency, that will be the speed of light divided by the wavelength. So if we know the speed of light and the wavelength, we can find the frequency. Okay. This brings us to the electromagnetic spectrum. So this light is an electromagnetic wave that could have very different wavelengths or very different frequencies. In fact, visible light, the light that we see that comprises the colors of the rainbow, is a very tiny region of what we call the visible light spectrum. Spectrum just means a whole range of light with a whole range of frequencies or a whole range of wavelengths. So we go from very high frequency in this end, or very low wavelengths, to very large wavelengths or very low frequency towards the right of the spectrum. And if you can look at the wavelengths here, they vary very, very widely. This is a very, very tiny wavelength, 10 to the minus 12 meters. This is a very large wavelength, 10 to the third, or a whole kilometer for a wavelength. And as we can see, the visible light region is a very tiny region within the spectrum. At the very small wavelength region, we have things like cosmic rays, gamma rays. A little bit larger wavelengths, we have X-rays, then UV light or visible light. Then we have infrared light, microwaves, and radio waves. And here are just some of those different uses for those different light waves. For example, X-rays are used to, well, X-rays, X-ray people. You know, infrared light is used in your television remotes, for example. All right, I would like you to memorize the sort of sequence of wavelengths of light. So we have gamma rays that are the lowest wavelengths or highest frequency, followed by X-rays, ultraviolet rays, visible rays, and so on. So the ones that I circled in purple, I would like you to remember that order. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about light as waves, let's perform some calculations involving light waves. And so let's look at number one. Number one says to asks us to calculate the wavelength in nanometers of red light. And they tell us that it has a frequency of 4.62 by 10 to the 14 per second. Okay, so we know that the speed of light is equal to the wavelength times the frequency. We know the frequency, we know the speed of light. It's a constant in a vacuum at least. So let's calculate the wavelength. The wavelength then will be equal to the speed of light divided by the frequency, which is going to be the speed of light to 3 sig figs is 3.00 by 10 to the 8 meters per second. The frequency of this light is 4.62 by 10 to the 14 per second. So the per seconds cancel out. But they want the speed of light in nanometers. We know that 1 nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters. This is one that we should definitely remember because it's going to come up a lot when we talk about light, especially visible light. So we can use that conversion. 1 nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters. We plug these into our calculator and we get a wavelength of 649 nanometers for the wavelength of this light. Okay, try number two on your own. This is asking you to calculate the frequency in Hertz of a wavelength of light that's 532 nanometer. That's the wavelength of a typical green laser. Try this on your own and then let me see what you, then we can go over it together. Okay, so again, we know the speed of light is wavelength times frequency. We know the wavelength, we know the speed, so let's find the frequency. The frequency will be equal to the speed divided by the wavelength, which is going to be equal to the speed of light is, again, 3.00 by 10 to the 8th meters per second. The wavelength that we had here is 532 nanometers. For those to cancel, we need to convert the nanometers to meters, and we know that 1 nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters. So meters cancel there, nanometers cancel there, and this will give us a frequency in per second, but we know that a per second and a hertz are the same thing. So if you just want to be complete, you can do this to convert from per second to hertz. And so this will give us, if we punch these into our calculator, it should give us 5.64 by 10 to the 14 hertz. Just a quick note on doing these calculations. In a calculator, sometimes you need to put parentheses around scientific notations. Otherwise, your calculator might give you weird results. So make sure to put parentheses around your scientific notations if you need to, if your numbers came out differently from what I have. Okay, so that's how you calculate the wavelength or frequency of light, any light, visible or not. And make sure that you remember the nanometer to meter conversion because that will come up a lot. And also the per second to hertz conversion, which is, they're just the same thing. Okay, now that we talk about how to calculate those properties of light, let's look at some other properties of waves in general that we also observe with light waves. So let's look at the idea of interference. And for interference, we're going to look at this. So now imagine that you have two waves, or two sources of waves on the surface of a water. So we're going to have one wave. Whoops, let's use a different color there. One wave. And then next to it, we're going to have another wave that's meeting up with it. Well, the way waves work is that if two waves line up such that their crests line up and their troughs line up, right? then the crests are going to add up. The crests are where there's more, if it's a wave on the surface of the ocean, it's where there's more water. The trough is where there's like less water. So they're going to add up together such that they create a bigger wave with a bigger crest and a bigger trough. That's a very horrible drawing. Let me see if I can scale this down a little bit. Okay. So they add up to create a bigger crest where the crests meet and a bigger troughs where the troughs meet. Sort of like that. My drawing is not very good, but I hope you get the idea. This is called constructive interference, right? Because when we look at a wave, if you draw a line straight through the middle, we can call the parts above this line the positive parts of the wave, and we can call the parts below the line the negative parts of the wave. And so where positive and positive parts meet up, they add up to give you a bigger positive, right? A bigger positive, and the negative and negative parts add up to give you a bigger negative. That's constructive interference. On the other hand, if you have a wave like that doesn't quite align up with a second wave. So let's say this wave goes down, then up, then down. So we have the positive parts not quite aligning and the negative parts not quite aligning. What would then happen is the positive parts would cancel out with the negative part of one wave, will cancel out with the negative parts of the other wave, such that in total we get, well, no waves happening, because the positive and the negative parts cancel here, the positive and negative parts cancel there, the positive and negative parts cancel here, so we get no wave. And that's another thing that can happen in wave when they interfere, and this will be called destructive interference, because the two waves destroyed each other because their crests and troughs don't quite are quite opposite to each other. So this is a thing that happens with waves. And so in real life, what you would see happening, for example, if these are two like drops on the surface of a water, where the bright green spots are like the crests and the black spots are the troughs, where the troughs meet, you'll get a bigger wave, and that's what these middle parts are. And where they exactly cancel out each other, you get just a flat area. And that's wave interference. Okay, another thing that waves can do, and I would like you to read up more on exactly how interference works. Another thing that waves can do is diffract. And so if I look at an example here with, let's say, water, a wave moving through a tiny slit, it would start to spread out after it hits the slit like this. And that phenomenon is called diffraction. So if I see the wave moving forward, it hits the slit, it then starts to spread out radially like this. This is wave diffraction. And then finally, I want to look at the differences between a traveling wave and a standing wave. So far we've been looking at waves like it's on the ocean or the surface of a lake. And those waves would be known as traveling waves. I made some simulations of it. There we go. I couldn't find a good animation for this online, so I wrote one myself. Here's an example of what we could call a traveling wave, kind of like the wave on an ocean. It's sort of, if I pause this, if we keep track of, let's say, this new wave that's coming in here, it would just move forward. And as it moves forward, it's transferring the energy and all that with it. So the traveling wave just keeps moving in some direction. However, a standing wave, if I scroll down here, kind of looks like this. It's a wave trapped in some box, for example. So here, this wave is trapped here, kind of like a string where the two edges are tied down so they can't move. And so the wave is trapped in there. It doesn't go forward or backwards, it doesn't go anywhere. And so we set up what we call a standing wave. It just moves in its little confined space. And this standing wave is what we're going to use to describe electrons when we come to that part of this chapter. So keep that in mind, that not all of what we know about waves on an ocean is going to translate smoothly to describing electrons as waves, because they're not traveling waves, they are in fact standing waves. Okay, that will bring us to the end of this section where we talked about light as waves. In our next video, we're going to talk about light as a particle. I'll see you then.